Hello, everyone. This is the final video in my little mini series that I began over a week ago, just called Final Week of Jesus, looking at the various texts. And I want to wrap it up in this episode. I want to talk about the arrest, the trial, the crucifixion, the burial, those final events that I think took place on a Thursday, right before the Passover. But what I want to do as I go along is not just survey the events and all of our sources, but to talk about method. And I'm using method the way most people use methodology. They say, what's your methodology? Methodology technically would mean your study of method. What are the methods people use? But then there's the method that one uses. In this case, the method I use in looking at these disparate sources that we have: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Thomas, as well as archaeological evidence that I've also surveyed in the previous series that I call Jesus Archaeology. And I covered that final week of Jesus in terms of the archaeological evidence. So I guess I could call this putting it all together, and that's what I want to do. So I'm going to share my screen. So this PDF that I want to begin with here, that you can see on the screen, is copied from a book by Burton Throckmorton called Gospel Parallels. And I'll put it up on the screen so you can order it if you want. There is a copy on the internet that's in the public domain, a PDF of an older edition that is perfectly functional. It's the one I'm using here, and it's similar to the one I've been using for years. It keeps getting updated and improved by the publisher. So if you're going to buy the book, you should get the latest edition. But if you just want to take a look at it, you could get this older edition that I'm using and that I've used for years teaching. And it is available as a PDF on the internet to be used in this way. And I'll put the link in the description. And then there's also a book by the American Bible Society that you see here, and it's called The Four Gospels, and it has Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So Throckmorton Gospel Parallels is just what we call the synoptics, the three. That is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, as you can see on the screen here. Now, as we start, keep in mind that Mark is our earliest record, as I understand it, and I think the arguments for that are strong. And then as you go off to the left or to the right, you're getting the editing, or basically rewritten Mark. In other words, you're getting areas of Mark where Matthew included something, and then maybe other things he didn't include, and where Luke includes something and other things he doesn't include. As you see right here, he doesn't include this: strike the shepherd, I'll go before you to Galilee. And then things that Luke has that are either earlier or not right here in Mark, sometimes things that are not in Mark at all. You'll notice all the parameters as we go through. So we're going to do the arrest, the trials, plural, because there was more than one, the crucifixion, and the burial of Jesus. And that's how we're going to wrap this up. And I'll say something at the end about the empty tomb. What are we going to do about the empty tomb and the appearances of Jesus? And I will cover that at the end and explain what I'm doing. So we're going to pick up the story here in Mark chapter 14, verse 26 following. Jesus and his followers have just eaten the Last Supper, which I don't think is the Passover, and you can hear the previous videos on that, all of my arguments. And they sung a hymn and went out to the Mount of Olives. So I think they're on Mount Zion. There's good evidence for that, I think, and you can hear my archaeology series on that. Mount of Olives is east of Jerusalem, and Jesus tells them, you're all going to fall away. And he quotes a text from Zechariah about striking the shepherd and the sheep being scattered. But then notice this: but after I am raised up, lifted up, literally, I will go before you to Galilee. Now, Matthew repeats that pretty much word for word. You can see how he follows Mark, but he adds, you will all fall away because of me this night. So he's explaining a little bit about what's ahead. It's a different kind of writing. But Luke drops that entirely, because he doesn't contain this section. And there's a good reason for that. These writers are rewriting. Some people call it editing. But this is the core story, the oldest narrative of Jesus we have is Mark. And then Mark gets rewritten by Matthew, large percent of it included. And also Mark is used by Luke as his main narrative source as well. Okay, so we'll go ahead. Here we get a 2-page spread. And Peter, of course, says, no way will I fall away. And Luke has moved some material up. He's just stylistically changing some things. Here we are at Gethsemane, the garden, and they went to a place which was called Gethsemane. And there he, that's Jesus, said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And notice what happens. He takes Peter, James, and John. So you can say they're moving away from the main group for something more private. And for Mark, I think it's another failure of the disciples. And he's presented about 5 or 6 of these so far. And he prays, Abba, Father, the intimate term for God, Abba, Father. Children in Israel call their father Abba today. All things are possible. Remove this cup from me. But yet, not what I will, but what you will. So he's surrendering to God, but he's clearly dreading what's going to happen. And he comes back, and this is to those 3 disciples, and they're asleep. And notice, this is a bit of a rebuke or certainly a disappointment. Simon, you're asleep. Could you not watch 1 hour? So he's been away maybe an hour, and they're asleep. Watch and pray. So he wakes them up and says, I know it's tough. The flesh is weak, the spirit's willing, but stay awake. And he goes away and he prays the same thing. And again he comes, finds them sleeping, for their eyes were heavy. But notice, but they did not know what to answer him. So they don't really have anything to say. And then a third time, and then he comes, are you still sleeping and taking your rest? Now you can see the tone of disappointment there. So this is another occasion, as I said, where the disciples utterly fail to understand. Now notice how it's rewritten in Matthew and in Luke. This is very important. Now Matthew pretty well follows Mark, as he often does, as you can see here, a few little editorial changes. But look over here at Luke. He does have Jesus go a stone's throw away. He doesn't have him take the 3 of the inner group. He doesn't want to emphasize the failure of the disciples, and especially not the leaders, Peter, James, and John. And he has him praying, but notice an angel comforts him. And he prays very earnestly. And when he finds them, they're sleeping for sorrow. So it sort of excuses them, and you don't really get much of a rebuke. He said, why do you sleep? And pray that you might not enter temptation, but you don't get the second and the third time. So it's a failure, it's a disappointment, but he mitigates it by retelling it in a very, very curtailed way. So this is the kind of thing that you get. So let's go on. So now they're in the Garden of Gethsemane, and immediately after this sequence of 3 prayers, Judas, one of the 12, remember he'd made a deal with the high priests, and they come with the crowd. They've got swords, clubs, the chief priests, the scribes, the elders. Remember, there's a group of chief priests. It's a whole family of Annas and his boys, and even his son-in-law Caiaphas, who's in office. And Judas betrays Jesus with a kiss, and they laid hands on him and seized him. And one of them who stood by, it doesn't say who, drew his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, day after day I was in the temple. Remember, every day he's going in the temple, and they wouldn't grab him. Why? Mark says because they're afraid of causing a riot, because the common people really like Jesus. But let the scriptures be fulfilled. It doesn't say exactly what scriptures Jesus refers to here, but Probably, as Matthew says, all the scriptures that generally talk about the rejection of God's servant and him being totally alone. And that's one of the themes that we just saw. I mean, when Jesus wants help in his agony, in his prayer, he's left alone. And then you get the shortest verse in Mark. I always remember it. Verse 50, and they all forsook him and fled. And that helps explain the next verse. Now, notice, and they all forsook him and fled. Matthew does follow, but Luke doesn't. Just like he doesn't mention Peter, James, and John being pulled away and segregated to pray with Jesus and watch with him, he doesn't want to say everybody left. But anyway, we have this strange verse, 51, and a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they grabbed him, they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked, streaking in the Garden of Gethsemane, we call it, right? Now, what a strange verse. Matthew just says, don't know what that's about. Luke, no idea what that's about. But it's an interesting tradition. People have come up with all sorts of interpretations. Is it literal? Is it spiritual? Is it symbolic? Many of you know I teach a course in the Gospel of Mark, and we cover this, and I'll put a link in the description. What I present in that course is what I learned from Norman Perrin, my teacher of Mark at the University of Chicago, who spent decades studying Mark and was a real expert on this text, historically speaking. And he argued that this young man represents a disciple. Remember, Jesus had said, if you would follow me, you need to leave everything. You need to forsake everything and take up a cross and follow. Here, the disciples are fleeing away from him, and this young man leaves everything, even his clothing, and he's naked in order to save his life. In other words, he's a counter idea of a disciple. Perrin didn't necessarily think that it refers to any person we could identify or even whether it happened. But for Mark, it's representing two forms of following Jesus. One is you run and leave it all behind to save your life. The other is you give it all up to follow, but you end up crucified. Here, Jesus is before what's called by Throckmorton here the Sanhedrin and Peter's denial. We're still in Mark 14. So they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and elders and scribes were assembled, and Peter follows from a distance into the courtyard. So this looks like a private house of the high priest. We're not sure, but the fact that it talks about a courtyard and there are guards out there. Now, this is not the Romans. This is basically the temple police, you might call it. The high priest has armed followers that protect him and his entourage and so forth. And they're the ones that have arrested Jesus. And so Matthew and Luke pretty well follow that. But Luke goes ahead and puts here, just stylistically, I think it makes more sense since you mentioned Peter in the courtyard. Let's go ahead and have the account of how he denies him. Maybe it makes more sense since you're talking about Peter. Just an editing move, kind of a cut and paste. But let's go back to Mark. Now the chief priests and the whole council sought testimony against Jesus, and they found none, for many bore false witness against him, and their witnesses did not agree. So the high priest is running the show here, and you get all of these people claiming different things Jesus said. And finally, the priest decides to answer, verse 61. Jesus is not talking. He's silent. He made no answer. And the priest says, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Okay. And Jesus says, I am. Now, the phrasing in Matthew, you have said so. And the phrasing in Luke, you say that I am. It has some different Greek tenses. It's sort of like saying in English, you just said it. It's not really in Greek a different response in substance, I don't think. And the high priest tears his mantle. Now, we don't know if this is Caiaphas or Annas. He's called the high priest, so you'd think it would be Caiaphas. What's going on here, and John explains it, as we'll see, as we go to John after this, he explains it, that Annas is basically in charge. Remember, he has 5 sons that serve as high priests in the first century, in the time of Jesus. He himself was a high priest first, and then he's succeeded by his various sons. And then he puts his son-in-law in charge, Caiaphas, for another stage of the trial. And Mark doesn't break it down in that kind of detail. So whoever this is, he tears his robe and he says, this is blasphemy. He claims to be the Christ. And also the real blasphemy is he says, I'm going to sit at the right hand of power and come in the clouds of glory. And this is a quotation from Daniel 7, and it refers to the Son of Man or the people of God taking over. So the Son of Man in Daniel, it's in Aramaic, is a representation of the people of God taking over. So what Jesus is really saying is, I am, and we're going to take over this place soon. That's the implication, because these texts would be known to people. Well, then notice they all condemn him as deserving death. And that's when they begin to spit upon him, cover his face jokingly and saying, hey, who hit you? If you're the Christ, you should be able to tell me. And these guards began to beat him up, okay? And this is basically repeated by Matthew and Luke. So they're staying pretty close to their source. Then you get in Mark the denial of Peter, and you have the 3 times. But notice this, Mark 15:1. As soon as it was morning, so this is in the middle of the night, the chief priests and the elders and the scribes and the whole council got together. And that's when they bind Jesus and lead him away and deliver him to the Roman governor, or the prefect, as he's called, of the province of Judea. And this is a Roman province, a military province that is directly under a procurator or a prefect. We call it a Roman governor. So directly under the emperor, Tiberius, is Pontius Pilate. So Mark seems to know of a kind of a 2-stage trial, but he doesn't give the details. We're going to get the details later in John. But this first trial is after midnight. It's in the wee hours of the morning. It's not yet morning. And you don't wake everybody up. Sanhedrin is from a Greek word. It just means to sit together. But the council here, the Sanhedrin in Greek, by tradition is 71 members. So if you have 35, you got a tiebreaker, and presumably the chief priests could probably break the tie. Anyway, we don't know that for sure, but there does seem to be another stage early morning, and then they deliver him over to the governor, and we're going to pick that up. Matthew has a special section that we're going to skip for now on the death of Judas. So now we're in Mark 15, and Pilate begins to question him. Notice very quickly, Pilate asks him, are you the king of the Jews? And he answers, you have said so. As I said, in Greek, it really means the same thing. It means something like, you're right, you got it right. And they make all of these charges against him, and Jesus will not answer. He won't speak. Now, according to Luke, he's then sent to Herod Antipas, the governor of Galilee. But since Jesus is from the Galilee, and Herod is in town for the Passover, this is the son of Herod the Great, Herod the Tetrarch. So Luke includes the beating up of Jesus, the abuse of Jesus, the physical abuse, mocking, and so forth. So notice when Mark finally does talk about this soldiers abusing him, this is Pontius Pilate's soldiers, not Herod the Great, right? These are Romans, and Luke doesn't include that. So that gives you a clue as to what Luke's doing. He wants to say that the Jewish authorities tortured Jesus, and Pilate did give him over, but he doesn't have anything about this very brutal treatment of striking him, spitting upon him, mocking him, and so forth. But he does have something similar with Herod. Okay, back to Mark. Now, Mark 15, 6 through 15. Now, at the feast, he, referring to Pontius Pilate, used to release one of the prisoners. The idea would be that he could partake of the Passover. So this is another indication that this is not after the Passover meal the next morning. You wouldn't do this double trial and staying up all night and all of that activity, all even the walking and the movement on the feast day. So the feast is near, according to Mark. It's not here yet. So I'm not sure that Mark does present the Last Supper as a Passover meal. That could be read in a different way. And remember, Mark's the one that says, not during the feast. The high priest told Judas, not during the feast. We don't want to do it. Got to do it before the feast. So this is before the feast. And there's this prisoner called Barabbas. And we don't know what this is, but Mark refers to an insurrection and murder being committed. Doesn't sound like what Jesus did when he shut down the temple for a day earlier in the week and declared it a den of shredders and robbers and so forth. But it does show that there's unrest and insurrection, and Barabbas must be well known. Just like the man running away naked, there's been endless speculation about Barabbas and who was he, and it means son of the Father, and is it a double for Jesus, and all kinds of things. But I think for Mark, what he's really saying rather clearly is that the high priest and this gang that has arrested Jesus would rather have an insurrectionist and a murderer release than Jesus. In other words, they want to crucify Jesus, and they're stirring up the crowd. And so he does apparently release Barabbas, and the crowd is shouting, crucify him. And Pilate wants to satisfy the crowd, and he scourges Jesus and delivers him back. And notice again, Luke, being kind of pro-Roman, doesn't mention the scourging of Jesus. That is very, very important. And then you get these brutal details that are chilling to even read. So Pilate releases him to be crucified. And then you get to verse 21, and they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who's coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus, to carry his cross. I did an episode on Simon of Cyrene and his sons because we've got archaeological evidence of their tomb in Jerusalem and their ossuaries being found. But let's stay with the text right here. And notice, even though Matthew mentions it, he doesn't say the father of Alexander and Rufus because it doesn't mean anything to him. This is a very important verse in Mark because Mark expects his readers to recognize these people. They're part of the movement. That's why we think Mark is the earliest. Nobody would put this in later, but you can see how somebody would take it out. And also Luke takes it out. He's got Simon of Cyrene coming in from the country and he carries the cross, but not this very important phrase, the father of Alexander and Rufus, which gives Mark's account, I think, a certain level of authenticity, especially with the archaeological evidence. Now, another point to make is Simon is coming in from the country. You don't come in from the country on Passover. It is a Sabbath day. So what I've argued is that Jesus is crucified on a Thursday, which is not the Passover yet. It's going to be that evening. And then Friday, which is the Passover. And Mark says that Sabbath was different because it was the preparation for the Passover. So obviously Simon's not walking into the country the morning after Passover, because even the rules about a Sabbath day's journey would be applicable. Everybody's not traveling around with all of this activity. It just doesn't make sense. And so the Good Friday tradition, I think, just doesn't work. Now you've got an addition by Luke because he really wants to emphasize the destruction of Jerusalem, but we're going to stay here primarily with Mark. And they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. And they offered him wine mixed with mirth, but he did not take it, and they crucified him. And they divided his garments, casting lots, and it was the third hour. The first hour begins in the morning at 6 a.m., our time today, and the third hour would be 9 in the morning. So Jesus is put on the cross at 9 in the morning. And then you got the thing about the inscriptions. Now, the people that are there passing by again, they're not out to watch a crucifixion on the holy day of Passover. You're supposed to stay in your homes. They would be still celebrating the feast the next morning after the Seder. But anyway, the crowds are wagging their heads and taunting Jesus and saying, "Who are you? Why don't you come down from the cross?" and so forth. And notice the legal charge is that he claims to be King of the Jews. So that thing about, "Are you the Christ?" You're right, you said it, makes him a claimant to be King of the Jews. And that is enough to have him crucified legally, because in this culture, you're basically claiming to be messianic. And there are two others that are crucified with him. They're called robbers in English. It's actually the Greek word leistes, which means brigands, or it implies a certain level of violence, just as it did with Barabbas, an insurrectionist. And notice over here, those who were crucified with him also reviled him. Now, notice that Luke wants to revise that and have one of them have a deathbed confession, so to speak. And according to Luke, one of those asked Jesus to remember him. He repents. I think Luke would say maybe he did revile him, but I have this tradition that one of them was saved by Jesus. "Today you'll be with me in paradise." And paradise is the word Luke uses for the place of the blessed dead. When you die, your soul goes to paradise, and that's before the resurrection of the dead. There's another story in Luke that makes that clear. And now when the 6 hours come, that would be noon, okay, after the 9 a.m. beginning, there's darkness until the 9th hour, so that would be 3 p.m. And at the 9th hour, Jesus cried, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani." And you have the Aramaic mixed with the Hebrew here. And notice Luke doesn't have it at all, because Luke does not want to present Jesus as forsaken. We're noticing these changes. You can see, I wouldn't call these editorial. I would call these recasting or rewriting, or I would even say, in some cases, overwriting. Generally, Matthew follows Mark on the arrest, the trial, the crucifixion, the burial, and the appearances in Galilee. But Luke has a completely variant story. And remember, Luke has no appearances in the Galilee. And in fact, he basically denies what Mark says about, "I'll see you in the Galilee," or what Matthew records, that they went to the Galilee and did see him, but some doubted, as he says at the end. And what does he do? He tells them, "Don't leave Jerusalem for 50 days, because 50 days from Passover is Pentecost or Shavuot, right?" And according to Luke and Acts, they stay in Jerusalem the whole time, unless they disobeyed Jesus. So you can see we have two traditions, a Jerusalem-based tradition that Luke wants to follow, but you see how Luke has changed a lot of things with his various motives, which are mainly two: to excuse the disciples and to excuse the Romans. And notice Luke does not have this. He takes it out because it would imply that God forsook Jesus. It's a difficult saying. People still talk about it today. Comes from Psalm 22. I'm going to take a look at that with you. But notice, if you go back, Luke has already said when he's first crucified, "Father, forgive them. They know not what they do." And then when Jesus dies and the centurion says, "Truly this was the Son of God," Luke doesn't put that. He has, "Certainly this man was innocent." So in Luke, you find that repeated motif. The Romans declare Jesus innocent. Pilate declares him innocent. He forgives his enemies, so they're innocent. The thief on the cross is forgiven. Everybody's forgiven in Luke. Forgiveness, forgiveness, forgiveness. And Mark, frankly, is a completely different image. It's the God-forsaken Jesus that is finally declared to be the Son of God. Now remember, in Mark, I get into this in great detail in my Mark course, that it begins with verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, and it ends here. Truly, this man was a son of God. But for Mark, if you want to say this, you've got to realize it's a dead Jesus on the cross, utterly forsaken by his followers, by the crowds, by the authorities, and even by God himself. In other words, it's an extreme emphasis on the forsakenness of Jesus. The women, though, are there, and they're named here: Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James. I believe that's Jesus' mother. Others argue it's not, but there's good arguments in Mark that it is. And Joseph, one of Jesus's brothers. These are the two brothers, James and Joseph, named in Mark 6, verse 3. Salome, probably a sister. And they had followed him, and notice many other women who came. So there is this entourage of women that stayed faithful and stayed at the cross. I'll put up an image that I think really captures this, that is in my book, The Jesus Dynasty. Very poignant to look at. And I'm convinced the crucifixion was on the Mount of Olives, but they follow at a distance. And notice when Jesus is buried, they're watching to see where he's going to be buried. By the way, in the Gospel of Peter, when Jesus dies, he says, my power, you have forsaken me. This is one interpretation. I don't think this is Mark's idea, but like his power has left him. God has pulled away from him and let him die. And then he was taken up, meaning he's taken up to heaven. Okay? Then we have the burial. Evening has now come, and it's the day of preparation before the Sabbath. Now remember, that Sabbath, though, is a Friday, not a Saturday. There's a double Sabbath. This is the Sabbath of Passover. Mark has already said it's the day of preparation for the Sabbath. And the Passover is on the 15th of the first month, called Nisan. And you've got this tradition about an unknown person, Joseph of Arimathea, but he's part of the council, and he apparently did not go along with the vote. He might have been present that morning, but he has a relationship with Pontius Pilate. He wants to fulfill the Jewish law that a body not be left on the cross overnight, or certainly not during a festival. And he checks, and Pilate checks because he grants his request, and he's surprised that he's already dead. And then he buys a linen cloth, takes him down, wraps him in the cloth, puts him in a tomb, rolls a stone against it. Notice, it does not say it's his tomb. Matthew says it's his tomb because Matthew understands it to be his tomb. But you're going to see, if you put all the text together, Matthew is probably interpolating here. He wants it to be a rich man's tomb because of Isaiah 53, which talks about the suffering servant made his grave with a rich man. So this tradition that it's Joseph's tomb, because Matthew puts it, begins to spread. And here you see it adopted by the Gospel of Peter. He brought him to his own tomb. This is like the most persistent thing. Every single person that knows anything about this says, oh yeah, Joseph took his body and put it in his tomb. Well, there are two burials, as we're going to see, okay? So that's the first share. And now I'm going to bring up the second one, and we're going to bring in some other material. I want to start first with Psalm 22. And the reason I want to start with this is because there's really good evidence that Mark is composing his account of the crucifixion based on the language of Psalm 22. And that does make us wonder whether Mark is being as historical as we might like to think he would be. I've marked these places in red, and notice, my God, why have you forsaken me? That's the beginning of a prayer of David in which he's suffering very mightily, surrounded by his enemies like vicious beasts, wounding him and piercing him, clawing at him like this. But at the end, it ends with joy and God delivering him. And yet, Mark does not have God deliver Jesus. Notice in Psalm 22, O Lord, be not far off, help me, deliver my soul, rescue me from the power of these dogs that are surrounded me, the mouth of the lion. So this individual was rescued. Jesus was not rescued, in Mark at least. You've also got the mocking, piercing of the hands and feet, like a lion, ku'ari. In other words, the idea that lions surround you and begin to claw at your hands and your feet as you try to hold them off. But look at this, they divide my garments among them and cast lots. Mark has that as a historical event. So that's going to raise the question that I'll address at the end. How can you tell when something supposedly happened according to Mark? I'm not talking about Matthew and Luke now because they're rewriting Mark. But in Mark, how can you tell the difference between that and Mark taking these prophecies and trying to make them fulfilled? And that would raise the question of whether Jesus did cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me? Where there was this kind of mocking, could have been, but we also know in Mark that the people heard him gladly. So you've got to say this is maybe a different group. And also, but particularly dividing the garments. That's not something you would normally do. And yet Mark reports it as something the Roman soldiers did. So I think we have to be somewhat skeptical about Mark's crucifixion scene being built wholly from historical events. But let's go on. Now here, we're going to look at two chapters of John, John 18 and John 19. And in the Jesus archaeology series, I already covered these archaeologically, but now I want to look at them textually. And notice right away, John seems to know Mark's account, and most scholars agree that he did know Mark, but he wants to clarify a lot of things. And a lot of it is just details. Like Mark has it, but he doesn't really explain. So for example, they go forth across the Kidron Valley. Mark just says they go to the Mount of Olives. So you've got to cross the valley. You go down and up. When I take tours there, we actually walk this exact trail. Where there was a garden and his disciples entered. So now we've got a garden, not just a place called Gethsemane. And Judas knew the place because Jesus often met there with his disciples. So the source that John is using is remembering this as the hiding place, the secret place, the safe place of Jesus on the Mount of Olives. Okay, we don't know where that is, but one thing we do know, the traditional Gethsemane at the foot of the Mount of Olives, where anyone could see you from the road, was definitely not the place. So it's somewhere up on the Mount of Olives. Then when you have Jesus arrested, notice all the soldiers and officers and chief priests kind of falling back on the ground. So John has a completely different scene and a completely different feeling about the Garden of Gethsemane. And then he has Peter as the one cutting off the ear, which Mark didn't know. He just says one of them. Okay, now notice this. So the band of soldiers, they seize Jesus and bind him, and they first take him to Annas, the father-in-law of Caiaphas. And Simon follows and enters the court of the high priest. So this is the house of Annas, which is right near the temple, as I understand it. And then you get the events. And then Annas sends him bound to Caiaphas. So notice, according to John, at the first place, Annas' house, Peter's recognized. He gets in. And at the second place, he's also recognized. Somebody who's a relative of the man who had his ear cut off sees him, and he says, I think it's you. And here you can see they led Jesus from the house of Caiaphas to the praetorium. We think the house of Caiaphas traditionally was later placed on Mount Zion, not far from where I've done excavating. And it's identified by the Armenians, by the Roman Catholics, or different locations, but they're on Mount Zion. And it's early in the morning. And notice, this is important. The Praetorium is the seat of judgment. It's on the west side of the city. Listen to my series on Jesus archaeology. This has been excavated and exposed, and we can even see the pavement stones. They did not enter the Praetorium, that's the Roman seat of government, inside Herod's palace, that they might not be defiled, but might eat the Passover. And that's where Pontius Pilate is, of course, staying. And then Pilate enters the Praetorium. And as you go through and read this, you can see that he goes inside and comes out, goes inside and goes out again. And you have this whole extended narrative that Mark doesn't really have. And finally, it ends with Pilate becoming concerned that maybe this guy is a danger and he could get in trouble, because if he's really claiming to be a king, then that would be sedition. And he sits down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, in Hebrew or Aramaic, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation of the Passover, about the 6th hour. John is using a different counting of time. It's more of a Roman scheme. So instead of it being the 3rd hour, it's the 6th hour, because the day technically begins at midnight, just like our Roman counting. And then if you count 6 hours, you come to 6 a.m. So it's just a statement of time. All of our sources pretty well put this at 9 o'clock in the morning. So Jesus has been up all night in all of our sources. And then they take Jesus out and they crucify him. And he also has the parting of the garments, and he has other things that take place. These things took place that the scripture might be fulfilled. They will look on him whom they pierced, not a bone will be broken. And so this material has kind of the same problem that the material in Mark has. And it explicitly says they did this to fulfill scriptures, like not breaking his legs. Well, they did it because he was already dead. And John's noting, like, the reason he was already dead is to fulfill scripture. And then another scripture. Now, Mark had quoted this one. This is from Zechariah. This then is the most important. Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, went to Pilate. He had Nicodemus, another secret follower, you might say, of Jesus, sympathizer. And he'd been mentioned earlier in the Gospel of John in chapter 3. And they get a mixture of spices and linen clothing. So they're going to bury him when they can. And they take the body and wrap it in a linen cloth with the spices. But notice this. Now, the place where he was crucified, there was a garden. And in the garden was a new tomb where no one had ever been laid. And because of the Jewish day of preparation, remember, that's for the Passover, as the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. Everybody forgets this because they think it's his tomb. Well, Joseph of Arimathea would not have a family tomb right near the place of crucifixion. It just doesn't make sense, historically, archaeologically, or whatever. So this is the first burial of Jesus. There are 2 burials of Jesus. Presumably, when the empty tomb is found Sunday morning, the Joseph party has come and moved it to a permanent burial. And that's what John presents in this verse. As this is a burial of convenience, an emergency burial. So I'm going to stop the share there. And I want to talk about the method of sorting this out historically. My method is to use a kind of a dual method textually. That is to take Mark, our earliest synoptic gospel, and John as an alternative passion account, as we call it, on the final days of Jesus, and to compare them very carefully. Not so much when they seem to have theological things added, because Mark has that too, but when they're talking about places and situations, to put those together, because suddenly you find that you have a rather coherent story. Think about the trial. What do we know about the trial? Because Mark doesn't name the high priests. plural, right? But John explains first you got to go to Annas, and that really fits historically because Annas controls everything. He's the godfather of this priestly mafia, as I call it, and they want to get Jesus killed because he's a great threat to them in every way, because their whole status and livelihood is based on the temple, and he has threatened that. I mean, some crazy guy can claim to be the Messiah, but so what? But if he goes in and does something and then says, this should be a house of prayer for all people, and then prophesies that it's going to be destroyed in some way, you know, this could very well be what took place. And Jesus appears to anticipate then his arrest, and he's willing to throw himself into the hand of God and pray for deliverance. And he ends up forsaken and dead. Then, if you compare the geography and the archaeological context and the chronology and what we know about Passover week and the days of the week, you do begin to get a framework. And you can also then bring in other sources that might shed light on the situation, because we do have the Gospel of Peter, and we have the statement in the Talmud that they hung Jesus on Erev Pesach, which is the day before Passover. Mentioned that already in this series. So you want to put everything together. And what you come up with is the following. Number one, Jesus ate a final meal with his disciples on the night that Paul calls the night he was betrayed. And it's not the Passover, it's before the Passover. Judas has made a deal not to betray him on the Passover, but before the Passover. And he does it that very night. Okay, that fits. Secondly, that evening meal is private, and it's not in Bethany where the whole group is. It's with the 12, according to Mark. I believe if you put the evidence together that James, the brother of Jesus, is also present, and maybe he's one of the 12. But either way, we can leave that to speculation. So he has a final evening meal. That night, he leaves, possibly on Mount Zion. Here I'm going by the archaeology. And he walks down through the city, down the Kidron Valley, up into the Mount of Olives where there's a hiding place. Now here I'm relying on John. The kind of thing that he adds doesn't seem to be anything to add theologically. He's trying to sketch out what happened that night, and I think he's got an alternative witness to what Mark was going by, and he's arrested. And whether the young man fled naked or not, that could be Mark theology. What are the bare facts, not to use a bad pun? Final evening meal, arrest in a secret hideout on the Mount of Olives. Judas betrays him with a kiss. That seems to be pretty solid. And then he's taken where? First to the house of Annas. Now, only John knows that. And that gives us a whole window into how this thing went on, because it was an illegal procedure in the middle of the night at a private house of the godfather Annas. And further, when they take Jesus finally to the house of Caiaphas, that's when the Sanhedrin would all be gathered together in the morning. So it has to be before 9 o'clock, but by 9 o'clock, they make it to Pontius Pilate at Herod's palace, the Praetorium area, as it's called. And Jesus' enemies with their supporters will not come inside. And when you read John's account and Mark's account, you can see how he goes in and comes out and goes in and comes out and goes in and comes out. And once you see the geography of it, it makes perfect sense. And then what about the burial? Well, the burial is a burial of emergency near the place of crucifixion. There's an unused tomb that nobody's ever used, being prepared by some family that owns it, and they simply stash the body there and block it up, and they put the spices on the body to preserve it, because they know that they cannot come back until Saturday night at the earliest, because you've got Friday the Passover, the high day Sabbath, And then Saturday, the regular weekly Sabbath, and you cannot be touching bodies and handling bodies and taking care of these kinds of things on the Sabbath. And as soon as the Sabbath is over, what do? They go and take the body and bury it permanently. Now, then all kinds of other questions arise, but I'm just talking about what the events were. So, in terms of taking the story further, here's what I want to suggest that you do if you're interested in this. I'm going to take you to my YouTube channel. This is James Tabor Videos, so it's easy to find. And here's the homepage. And I want you to notice this post right here. What really happened Easter morning? There's a picture of a tomb. It's a first century tomb with the opening there. And I did this 2 weeks ago, and I narrate in detail here my understanding of what happened Sunday morning. And I would want to encourage you all to take a look at it. So I'll put the link in the description, and that will give you my take on Easter morning, which I've already covered in a number of ways on YouTube. And I don't want to add it to this one because it goes into another whole realm. So as far as final days of Jesus, he's dead on Thursday. He's buried hastily in a tomb near the place of crucifixion, and then he's reburied. Now, all of the questions about, well, how could they believe in resurrection? And what about the appearances and all of that? That's what I cover in the video. So please listen to it and give it a chance. And I think you're going to find something surprising about it because it actually relies on, for reconstruction, the earliest and only first-person testimony to the resurrection of Jesus that survives. And I'm not even going to tell you what that is. Say, well, is that Mark or Matthew or Luke or John? None of those. So hope that intrigues you enough. Take care. And I hope this series has been beneficial to your learning and to your understanding. Keep up your study, and I'll see you soon.